On the distant, barren planet of Xylaria, the alien people lived a meager existence. Under the merciless rule of a foreign king, generations had once flourished on Xylaria, a world of rough terrain and hardy life, where families clung to traditions passed down through countless ages. Though resources were scarce, the people managed to sustain themselves, cultivating sparse fields and building humble communities across the planet's gray, rocky landscape. Their livelihoods depended on their resilience, and in return, they fostered a deep love for their land and a collective bond with one another. But that unity was shattered when a new king seized the throne, a ruler with no ancestral claim to the planet's history, no empathy for its people, and no mercy in his rule. This king came from an alien species altogether. His mother had married into Xylaria's royal family as part of a strategic alliance, but she herself hailed from another world, a place known for its cold-blooded aristocracy. Her son, now seated on Xylaria's throne, had inherited only her scorn for the common people of Xylaria, whom he saw as expendable laborers rather than subjects deserving protection and care. The king's rule was marked by relentless oppression. Almost immediately after taking the throne, he began implementing harsh new taxes that plunged his subjects into destitution. He issued decree after decree, each one more severe than the last, demanding ever greater sums from the people. And in a cruel twist of fate, these taxes were not merely financial. They were demands on every part of life in Xylaria: crops, livestock, and even the few natural resources that could be gathered from the planet's stony surface were appropriated by the king's collectors. He left nothing for the people but the bare minimum to scrape by, reducing once proud families to abject poverty. To enforce these brutal demands, the king established a network of enforcers, each more ruthless than the last. These enforcers were loyal only to him, drawn from the king's own species and trained to follow his orders without question. Dressed in dark, imposing armor, they roamed the villages and farms, extracting tribute with iron-fisted precision. Anyone who resisted, anyone who dared to plead for mercy or complain about the conditions was swiftly punished. Sometimes the punishment was imprisonment, sometimes a public beating, and occasionally, those who defied the king simply disappeared. Among the most brutal of these enforcers was Captain Virik, a towering figure who carried out the king's will with unyielding loyalty. Known as the Butcher among the people, Virik had no qualms about punishing entire communities for the disobedience of a single individual. Families huddled in fear as he and his men descended upon their homes, demanding that they meet quotas and provide offerings they could scarcely afford. In one village, an elder tried to reason with Virik, explaining that a drought had left their crops shriveled and their fields barren. The captain responded by ordering the destruction of what little they had, making it clear that pleas would be met with even harsher retribution. Life on Xylaria soon became a daily struggle for survival. People fell into a rhythm of suffering, waking each day not to hope but to dread. For the elderly, it was a bleak existence filled with the knowledge that they would leave behind nothing but a legacy of despair. For the young, it was worse. They grew up knowing only oppression, their innocence stripped away by the need to fight for basic sustenance. Children who once dreamed of futures filled with adventure and possibility now learned to hide from the king's men, their laughter silenced by fear. Beyond taxes, the people of Xylaria were deprived of essential rights. Healthcare, once provided by a network of local healers and herbalists, was now out of reach. These healers, once valued members of their communities, were forced to abandon their work, unable to obtain the rare medicinal herbs now requisitioned by the king. Without access to healing, simple illnesses turned deadly. A fever could claim a life. An infection could spread unchecked. And the people learned to mourn quickly, as death became an ever-present part of their lives. In addition to the absence of health care, social protections vanished. Those who were too old or too weak to work were left to fend for themselves, ignored by the new regime. As the oppression continued, despair seeped into the very soil of Xyleria. The people became shadows of their former selves, moving through life with hollow eyes and weakened spirits. Small acts of resistance flared up occasionally, whispers in the dark, gatherings in secret places, families sharing what little food they had with one another. But these moments of defiance were fleeting. Viric's spies were everywhere, listening for any hint of rebellion. Anyone caught organizing against the king's rule faced swift and brutal punishment. And so, for many years, the people learned to keep their heads down and endure in silence, praying that perhaps, someday, the weight of the king's cruelty might lift. Despite their suffering, a flicker of hope remained. Xyleria's culture was deeply rooted in stories, tales of heroism and endurance passed down through generations. Elders recounted ancient myths about a power that lay hidden within the planet itself, a protective spirit that watched over Xyleria and would awaken only in times of greatest need. According to legend, this spirit had once shielded their ancestors from a terrible calamity, unleashing a wave of energy so powerful it had reshaped the mountains and calmed the seas. But to summon this spirit, the people would need unity and courage. They would need to believe that they could overcome their oppressor, that even in the darkest times, hope could survive. One evening, under the cover of night, a small group of villagers gathered in a secluded cave. There, surrounded by the flickering light of a single torch, they spoke of the future. They whispered of a time when the people might rise together and reclaim their lives. The meeting was brief. Each person there knew the risk they took simply by attending, but it was enough. A seed had been planted, a seed of rebellion that would take root slowly, silently, in the hearts of Xyleria's oppressed people. The king, oblivious to the unrest simmering beneath the surface, continued to live in opulence. His palace, a towering fortress of gleaming stone and shimmering metal, stood as a testament to his wealth and power. While his people starved, he feasted. While his people suffered, he enjoyed the luxuries that only a king could afford. To him, the people of Xyleria were little more than insects, creatures to be exploited for his gain. He saw their suffering not as a burden to bear, but as evidence of his own strength. And as long as they obeyed, he believed himself untouchable. But unbeknownst to the king, his rule had already begun to crack. Beneath the surface of Xyleria's gray landscape, in the hearts of those he oppressed, an ember of defiance glowed, waiting only for the right moment to ignite into flame. The alien king, for all his cruelty and power, had made one fatal mistake. He had underestimated the will of the people, the strength that lay hidden within their suffering. And as he continued to turn a deaf ear to their cries, he had unwittingly set in motion the first steps toward his own downfall. The people of Xyleria had endured much, but as they struggled to survive in the face of impossible hardship, they began to remember the old tales. They began to whisper to one another in quiet, secret meetings, the stories of ancient spirits, of hidden powers, of hope that had once been theirs. And though they were far from ready to challenge their king openly, a new resolve was taking shape. Someday they would reclaim their planet. Someday they would see the end of the cruel king's reign. Despite the brutal conditions forced upon them, the people of Xyleria were not without courage. For years, they had lived in silence under the shadow of their king's merciless rule. They watched as their children grew frail from hunger, as the elderly faded without the dignity of proper care, and as their homes and livelihoods were stripped away piece by piece. But no matter how much the king sought to extinguish their spirit, a spark of resistance remained within the hearts of the Xylerian people. This spark was ignited by a shared understanding that change would not come easily, nor would it be immediate. Their rebellion could not be one of swords and open warfare. Such action would be met with swift and devastating retribution from the king's elite forces. Instead, the people chose a path of subtlety, a quiet defiance that spread slowly through every village and settlement across the planet. This silent rebellion began as whispers in the shadows, murmured secrets in the darkness, and knowing glances exchanged between neighbors. It was a rebellion fueled by hope, by a belief in the power of unity and endurance, and a longing to be free. One evening, in a remote village nestled between the rugged mountains, a small group gathered in secret. These were farmers, laborers, mothers, and elders, ordinary people united by the extraordinary burden they shared. They met under the dim glow of a single lantern in a secluded barn, hidden from the prying eyes of the king's enforcers. Among them was a young woman named Elara, known for her fierce will and her skill with words. Though she had lost family to the king's tyranny, she carried her sorrow with a quiet strength that inspired those around her. That night, Elara spoke to her neighbors, planting the seeds of rebellion. "We have suffered long enough," she said, her voice a soft but unwavering echo in the silence. "Our children know only hunger. Our elders die without honor. The king takes all we have, but he cannot take our spirit unless we allow it. We must find a way to show him that we will not be broken." Elara's words resonated deeply within the small gathering, sparking something that had long lain dormant in their hearts. As she spoke, an elder named Rorik, his face etched with the wisdom of many harsh seasons, added his voice to hers. "We are not alone," he said, looking into the eyes of each person there. "Across Sileria, others suffer as we do. Others carry this same burden. We must reach them, unite them. Only together can we make our voices heard." The idea of unity was both inspiring and daunting. They knew they could not overthrow the king with force, nor could they openly defy him without facing certain death. And yet, the people of Sileria possessed a strength the king could never understand: resilience. With patience and ingenuity, they would wage a rebellion that defied all conventions. A rebellion fought not with weapons, but with the power of persistence and solidarity. In the days and weeks that followed, small acts of defiance began to take root across the planet. Farmers would keep a portion of their harvest hidden from the king's collectors, distributing it among the hungry families in their villages. Artisans would create symbols of resistance, simple badges carved from stone or wood, which they wore as silent reminders of their shared struggle. These symbols began to spread, passed from person to person, a covert emblem of hope that defied the king's rule. As the rebellion grew, so did the king's suspicion. His enforcers, ever vigilant and ruthless, began to take note of the subtle signs of resistance. Villagers caught with the symbols were punished severely, and those suspected of withholding goods faced harsh penalties. But even in the face of these reprisals, the people continued their silent rebellion, each act of defiance strengthening their resolve. The king's punishments, rather than breaking their spirits, only fueled their determination. The silent rebellion reached its peak when a group of 100 citizens, chosen from villages across Sileria, made a daring decision to approach the king's palace. They were representatives of their communities, ordinary people who had agreed to risk everything to speak on behalf of those who could not. Their journey to the palace was grueling, as they traveled in small groups to avoid detection, navigating the barren and unforgiving landscape. Many had never seen the palace, had never set foot outside their own villages, and yet they moved forward, propelled by a shared purpose. When the 100 reached the palace gates, they were met not with the hospitality of a ruler who cared for his subjects, but with the cold steel of the king's guards. The guards sneered at their worn clothes and weary faces, dismissing them as mere pests unworthy of the king's attention. But the people stood firm, their voices steady as they demanded an audience with their ruler. For days, the 100 returned to the palace gates, undeterred by the king's refusal to acknowledge them. Each morning, they assembled at the gates and repeated their demand, unwavering in their commitment to be heard. And each day, the king ignored them, believing that his silence would crush their resolve. But the people of Sileria were resilient, and their silent rebellion was more powerful than he could have anticipated. As the days turned into weeks, the king grew uneasy. His enforcers had warned him that the rebellion was spreading, that whispers of defiance were reaching even the most remote corners of the planet. The king, though ruthless, was not entirely ignorant of the danger such unity posed to his reign. He knew that if he allowed this silent rebellion to continue unchecked, it could inspire a full-scale uprising. And so, reluctantly, he agreed to meet with the representatives of his people. The 100 were escorted into the palace, their footsteps echoing against the cold stone floors as they were led to the throne room. The king sat upon his gilded throne, draped in opulent robes, his face a mask of disdain as he looked upon the weary figures before him. To him, they were nothing more than beggars, their faces lined with the dirt and toil of their lives. He had no empathy for them, no understanding of their suffering. He saw them only as a nuisance, a problem to be dealt with swiftly and decisively. When the representatives finally spoke, they did so with dignity and restraint. They asked not for wealth or luxury, but for the bare minimum of what was needed to live with dignity. They requested a reduction in taxes, so that they might have enough to feed their families. They asked for access to basic health care, so that their children and elders would not die of preventable diseases. They spoke not only for themselves, but for every suffering soul on Xyleria. The king's response was swift and brutal. He rose from his throne, his voice filled with contempt as he dismissed their requests. "You dare to come before me with demands?" He sneered. "You are my subjects. You will do as I command without question. For this insolence, I will double your taxes. You will pay for your audacity with every last coin, every last morsel." The 100 representatives stood in stunned silence, the weight of the king's cruelty bearing down upon them. Their silent rebellion had been met with open hostility, their hopes crushed beneath the heel of the king's wrath. As they left the palace, they knew that they would return to their villages, with nothing but despair to offer their families. And yet, within each of them, a new fire had been kindled. They had looked into the eyes of their oppressor and seen his true nature. They understood, now more than ever, that he would never be swayed by reason or compassion. Their silent rebellion would have to grow louder. Returning to their villages, the representatives carried with them the king's message of cruelty. They shared with their people the king's refusal, his scorn, and his threats. And as they spoke, the people's hearts hardened with anger. They would no longer wait in silence. They would resist openly, with every means at their disposal. The symbol of their rebellion spread like wildfire, worn proudly on the chest of every villager, farmer, and laborer across the planet. It was a declaration of defiance, a pledge to fight for their future, no matter the cost. Thus, the people's silent rebellion transformed into something stronger, fueled by a determination to end the king's tyranny. The king's oppressive rule had once cast a shadow over every corner of Xyleria, but now, within the hearts of the people, a new light had been kindled, a light that would not be easily extinguished. The rebellion was no longer silent. It had become a roar, a wave of defiance that would soon wash over the land, threatening to consume the king and his throne. As the rebellion grew louder and bolder across Xyleria, the king remained oblivious to one crucial detail: his daughter, Princess Arya, had become a target in the turmoil that surrounded them. She was known throughout the land, not only for her beauty, but also for her kind heart. Arya spent her days wandering the palace gardens, often slipping away from the watchful eyes of the guards, to offer help to the poor and the needy, bringing food and aid to those suffering under her father's rule. While the king basked in the comforts of his lavish palace, his daughter ventured into the heart of Xyleria, forging connections with its people and gaining their admiration. Little did she know that her compassion would soon lead her into the center of a conspiracy that could change the fate of the kingdom. On a fateful morning, while the sun rose high above the castle, casting long shadows across the cobblestone paths of the royal gardens, Arya decided to take one of her secret excursions. She donned a simple cloak that concealed her royal attire, hoping to blend in with the common folk. Her heart raced with anticipation as she envisioned the joy on the faces of the villagers when she arrived with baskets of food. However, the tension in the air felt palpable that day, an undercurrent of unrest swirling around her like a storm waiting to break. Unbeknownst to her, the whispers of rebellion had reached the ears of the king's most trusted advisor, Lord Valen. a man whose loyalty to the crown was overshadowed by his thirst for power. He had watched as the people rallied against the king, and with each passing day, he grew increasingly paranoid about the potential threat to his position. The princess's visits to the village made her a symbol of hope for the people, and Valen understood that if the king's daughter were to join the rebellion, the fragile balance of power could tip in favor of the oppressed. That morning, as Arya made her way through the bustling marketplace, her eyes sparkled with delight as she interacted with the townsfolk, accepting their gratitude with a humble smile. She spoke with an elderly woman who recounted tales of her youth, and she shared laughter with children playing in the streets. For a moment, Arya felt a sense of normalcy that eluded her in the palace, a reminder that there was a world beyond the walls of her gilded cage. But lurking in the shadows, Lord Valen had devised a plan to rid himself of the princess, a kidnapping that would strike at the heart of the rebellion and reassert the king's dominance. He dispatched a group of mercenaries, ruthless men trained to carry out the most heinous acts without remorse. As they positioned themselves around the marketplace, they waited for the perfect moment to strike. Their eyes locked onto the unsuspecting princess. As Arya handed out the last of her provisions, she felt a chill run down her spine. It was an instinctive reaction, a whisper of danger that lingered just beyond her awareness. But before she could process her unease, the mercenaries sprang into action. In a swift and coordinated assault, they surged forward, surrounding her and blocking her escape. Panic erupted in the marketplace as villagers screamed and scrambled for safety. But the mercenaries were relentless. They grabbed Arya, muffling her protests as they carried her away, leaving chaos in their wake. As the mercenaries fled into the forest, Arya fought against her captors, her heart racing with fear. "Let me go," she shouted, but her voice was swallowed by the surrounding trees. The forest quickly enveloped her, the sunlight fading as the thick canopy above blocked the rays of hope. Her mind raced with thoughts of her father, and the chaos that would ensue upon her. Disappearance. Would he search for her, or would he view her as another pawn in his game of power? Meanwhile, word of the kidnapping spread like wildfire among the villagers. The news reached the representatives of the silent rebellion, igniting a fury within their hearts. They had watched their king oppress them for too long, and now he had taken the one person who had dared to show them kindness. Fueled by anger and desperation, they convened in their secret meeting place, determined to devise a plan to rescue the princess. Elara, who had become a figurehead for the rebellion, stood before the gathered crowd, her eyes ablaze with conviction. "We cannot let this act of cruelty go unanswered. Princess Arya is not our enemy. She has shown us compassion when others would not. We must save her, not only for her sake, but for our own. If we can bring her back, we can unite the people against her father's tyranny." The representatives exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of determination and trepidation. They knew the king's guards would be on high alert, searching for the princess and punishing anyone suspected of aiding in her escape. Yet, the stakes had never been higher, and they were willing to risk everything for a chance to free Arya. Under the cover of night, the rebellion began to organize its efforts. Groups of villagers moved quietly through the forest, guided by Elara and Rorik, who had lived in these woods for years. They knew the terrain well and had scouted potential hideouts where the mercenaries might take the princess. With each step deeper into the forest, the tension grew, but so did their resolve. They whispered strategies, preparing for the encounter they knew would be fraught with danger. Back in the mercenaries' camp, Arya found herself confined within a crude wooden shack, the darkness enveloping her as she tried to calm her racing heart. Though fear gripped her, she also felt a spark of defiance igniting within her soul. She thought of her people, the ones she had met in the marketplace, their faces etched in her memory, and she knew she could not remain a passive prisoner. As the sun began to rise, she gathered her strength and began to strategize. She quietly searched her surroundings, looking for anything she could use to her advantage. The shack was poorly constructed. The walls were thin, and she could hear the muffled voices of her captors outside. Their laughter sent chills down her spine, and she knew she had to act quickly before they realized. The princess's spirit was unbroken. In a moment of opportunity, Arya stood up and began to call for help. Someone, please, I am Princess Arya. You must help me. Her voice echoed through the trees, carrying a blend of desperation and determination. The mercenaries, hearing her pleas, exchanged glances, uncertain of how to handle a captive who refused to succumb to fear. It wasn't long before one of the guards approached the shack, opening the door with a sneer. You think your cries will save you? You're nothing but a pawn in your father's game. You'll be exchanged for a hefty ransom, and there's nothing you can do about it. Arya's heart raced, but she held her ground. You underestimate me. You may have taken me from my home, but you cannot take my will. I will not be your bargaining chip. Her words caught the guard off guard. His momentary hesitation ignited something in her. She understood that if she could instill doubt in the hearts of her captors, perhaps they would falter. She began to speak of the people, of their suffering under the king's reign, and the silent rebellion brewing outside the palace walls. Do you not see? She implored, her voice rising in passion. You may believe you serve the king, but you are helping to perpetuate a cycle of pain. If you let me go, I can help bring about change, true change. You don't have to be part of this cruelty. The guard scowled, but Arya could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. She seized the moment. If you release me, I will speak to my father. I can make him understand. This kingdom can be different. You could be heroes, not villains. As Arya continued to speak, her heart surged with the realization that she was not entirely powerless. The words poured from her lips, and she saw how the guard shifted uncomfortably, wrestling with his loyalties. Just as she felt a glimmer of hope, a commotion erupted outside the shack, and she heard the unmistakable sound of fighting. The rebellion had come to her rescue. In the chaos that ensued, Arya knew she had to act. With a burst of energy, she pushed past the guard, who was momentarily stunned by the surprise of her escape. She raced into the forest, following the sounds of conflict. Branches scratched at her skin as she pushed through the underbrush, her heart pounding with adrenaline. The rebellion fought fiercely against the mercenaries, who were taken aback by the unexpected assault. Elara and Rorik led the charge, their voices rallying the villagers to stand strong. The scene was chaotic. Villagers, wielding makeshift weapons, clashed with the mercenaries, determined to rescue their princess. Arya's heart swelled with pride as she saw her people fighting for her, but she knew she needed to find them. Just as she rounded a tree, she spotted Elara, her fierce spirit lighting up the darkness of the forest. Princess Arya, Elara called, her voice cutting through the din of battle. Over here. Without hesitation, Arya sprinted towards her, relief flooding her veins as she felt the embrace of her people surrounding her. I thought I lost you, Elara said, a fierce determination shining in her eyes. But we won't let them take you from us. Together, they fought back against the mercenaries, Arya feeling a sense of empowerment she had never known before. No longer was she a passive pawn. She was a warrior for her people. As she swung a branch against one of her captors, she felt the tide of the battle shifting. The mercenaries began to falter, overwhelmed by the sheer will of the villagers. One by one, they retreated, and as the last of them fled into the woods, the rebellion erupted in cheers of triumph. Exhausted but filled with elation, Arya turned to her people, gratitude spilling from her heart. You fought for me, for us. I promise to help you bring about the change this kingdom desperately needs. In that moment, under the ancient trees of Xyleria, the princess understood the power of unity and the strength of a people who refused to be silenced. The kidnapping had awakened something within her, an unyielding resolve to fight for justice and compassion in her kingdom. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue over the forest, Arya felt hope blooming in her heart. The rebellion had begun, and together, they would pave a new path for Xyleria I, where no one would suffer in silence again. We will confront him and demand an end to this oppression. Together, we will reclaim our kingdom. Cheers erupted from the crowd, the sound echoing through the trees like a battle cry. Among the crowd, Elara stepped forward, her expression fierce. We've spent years watching our loved ones suffer while the king lives in luxury. We've gathered strength from our pain, and now we will show him the power of our unity. Arya nodded, grateful for Elara's unwavering spirit. We need to be strategic. We must gather as many supporters as possible. Our allies within the castle will be essential in this fight. We can't underestimate the strength of the king's guard, but with careful planning, we can take him by surprise. As the night wore on, the rebels crafted their plan, a mixture of courage and caution fueling their discussions. They would infiltrate the palace during the upcoming festival, a celebration that would draw the king's attention away from his duties. It was the perfect opportunity to strike, a moment when the palace would be filled with revelers, and the king would let his guard down. Meanwhile, in the palace, King Thalion remained blissfully ignorant of the storm brewing outside his walls. For him, the festival was a time for celebration, a way to remind his subjects of his power and wealth. He reveled in the lavish preparations, counting the days until he could showcase his might, unaware that the very foundation of his reign was crumbling beneath him. On the night of the festival, the palace was aglow with lights, and laughter filled the air as nobles and citizens alike gathered to celebrate. Arya and the rebels moved stealthily through the shadows, dressed as commoners to blend in with the throngs of people. Each step was filled with tension, every glance a reminder of the risks they were taking. As they approached the palace gates, the guards, distracted by the festivities, failed to notice the small group slipping past them. The rebels quickly made their way through the opulent halls, each chamber a stark reminder of the excesses that had led to their suffering. Gold and jewels adorned every surface, the lavishness contrasting sharply with the poverty they had endured outside. Finally, they reached the grand hall, where the king stood proudly before his court, a crown gleaming atop his head. His laughter echoed through the chamber as he regaled his guests with tales of past victories, completely unaware of the impending reckoning. Arya's heart raced as she prepared to confront her father, the man she had once admired but now saw as a tyrant. With a determined breath, she stepped into the light, her voice rising above the revelry. "Father, it is time to answer for your crimes against the people of Xyleria." The hall fell silent, and all eyes turned to Arya. Gasps of shock rippled through the crowd, and the king's expression shifted from amusement to anger. "Arya, what is the meaning of this? You dare interrupt my celebration?" Arya stepped forward, her heart pounding, but her resolve unwavering. "You have oppressed our people for far too long. They are starving while you feast. Your reign of terror ends tonight." King Thalion's face flushed with rage as he processed her words. "You foolish girl. You would side with traitors and rebels? Do you not see the chaos you invite?" Elara, standing beside Arya, shouted back, "Chaos? The true chaos lies in your ignorance. You've turned a blind eye to the suffering of your subjects. No longer will we live in fear of your tyranny." The tension in the hall crackled like lightning. The nobles, torn between loyalty to the crown and the truth of Arya's words, exchanged nervous glances. The king's voice boomed with authority, but there was a tremor of uncertainty beneath it. "You will regret this, Arya. I am your father, and you will obey me." "Obey you?" Arya shot back, her voice steady and strong. "You have failed us as a king and as a father. I choose to stand with my people." In that moment, the crowd erupted into murmurs, the tension transforming into an electric charge that filled the air. The king's grip on power began to slip as the realization dawned on him his daughter, the very symbol of his legacy, had turned against him. As the murmurs grew louder, voices began to rise in support of Arya. Down with the tyrant. Some shouted, while others echoed her sentiments. The people deserve better. Seeing the tide shift against him, King Thalion's expression hardened. "You would betray your own blood? You are nothing without my crown." He gestured to his guards, signaling them to seize Arya and the rebels. But before the guards could act, the crowd surged forward, emboldened by Arya's bravery. Elara led the charge, rallying the villagers who had gathered to witness the festival. "For our freedom," she cried, her voice ringing with conviction. A fierce battle erupted within the Grand Hall as the guards clashed with the rebels. Arya fought alongside her people, a newfound strength surging through her as she wielded a sword for the first time. The sounds of clashing metal and cries of defiance filled the air, creating a cacophony that reverberated throughout the palace. The fight was intense, but the rebellion had the advantage of numbers and a fervent desire for justice. As Arya confronted her father, she saw not just a king, but a man blinded by his own power, desperate to hold onto a crumbling throne. "It's over, father," she said, her voice resolute. "The people will no longer live in fear of you." In the chaos of battle, a moment of clarity struck the king. His gaze shifted from Arya to the rebels surrounding him, their faces filled with determination and hope. For the first time, he truly saw the consequences of his actions, the pain he had caused, the lives he had destroyed. With a final cry of defiance, he drew his sword, ready to fight to the bitter end. But as he swung at his daughter, Arya dodged, her heart heavy with sorrow. "I don't want to fight you," she shouted, desperation lacing her words. "You can still choose to change." For a brief moment, the king hesitated, caught between his pride and the realization that his reign had become a prison for his people. But before he could respond, one of his guards, seeing the king's moment of weakness, lunged forward, and in a shocking turn of events, he betrayed his king, striking the tyrant down. The hall fell silent as King Thalion staggered, confusion and pain etched on his face. With one final, broken breath, the king collapsed to the floor, the crown rolling from his head, a symbol of his fallen authority. Gasps filled the room, the weight of the moment settling over the rebels and nobles alike. Arya knelt beside her father, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I didn't want it to end this way," she whispered, her heart aching with the loss of the man she had once loved. "I wanted you to see what you could have built with us, not against us." In the aftermath of the battle, the hall transformed into a scene of both victory and mourning. The rebels had triumphed, but the cost had been great. The nobles, witnessing the king's downfall, began to rethink their loyalties. Arya stood tall, her heart heavy yet filled with purpose as she addressed the crowd. "We have freed ourselves from the chains of oppression, but we must also rebuild. We need to create a kingdom where every voice matters, where compassion guides our actions." Her words resonated through the hall, igniting a spark of hope among the villagers and nobles alike. In the days that followed, a council was formed, consisting of representatives from all walks of life, rebels, nobles, and commoners alike. Arya took her place as a leader, guiding them in the establishment of a new order, one that prioritized justice and equality. The people celebrated their victory, but they also mourned the loss of life, the lives forever changed by the tyrant's rule. Arya vowed to honor those sacrifices by ensuring that no one would ever suffer under the weight of oppression again. As the sun rose over Xyleria, illuminating the kingdom with a warm glow, Arya felt a sense of peace washing over her. The shadows of the past began to fade, replaced by a vision of unity and strength. Together, they would forge a new path, one where love, compassion, and justice reigned supreme. The fall of the king had marked the end of an era, but it also heralded the dawn of a brighter future. Arya, once a pawn in a cruel game, had emerged as a beacon of hope, a princess transformed into a queen who would lead her people toward a destiny they could create together. With each step into this new era, Arya felt the weight of her responsibility, but she also felt the strength of her people beside her. Together, they would ensure that Xyleria would never again fall into darkness. The kingdom had risen from the ashes, and its true potential was finally within reach.